Olá, eu queria chamar então aqui o Matias Pedevilla e a Ivon Saez, que vão agora apresentar uma sessão focada em aspectos relacionados, né, às cadeias de valor e os seus impactos no contexto, e os impactos, né, os novos impactos, né, do mundo arm's length no contexto da América Latina. Ivon, Matias, muito obrigado. Com vocês.
Thank you very much, Durval. Well, my name is Ivon Saez. I'm a female. I am Mexican. I have brown hair, and I'm wearing a gray suit and a white shirt. I am very happy to be here with you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Matias Pedevilla. I'm a male. I'm originally from Argentina. Brown hair, and I'm middle-aged. And I am wearing a suit without a tie and a white shirt. So before starting the session, I would like to personally thank Durval, Michela, Romero, the entire PwC Brazil firm to invite us. It's another time. I'm seeing a lot of good old friends in the audience. So it's always a pleasure to work together. Now, with new challenges ahead of us. So, as part of my roles, I'm leading our trust solutions practice in the US, and I'm also supporting Horacio globally, leading our global documentation service offering for the network. And last but not least, I'm supporting our Latin American Business Center in the US as well. And I've been supporting the practice and supporting Juan Carlos Ferreiro leading the Latin American practice as well. So the idea of the session today is, in a nutshell, we will try to be a link between of what we discussed so far at the global level and what Michela and Romero discussed, connected to the operating models that we've seen in the region, the potential future ones, the challenges, and most importantly, what to expect. And what to expect, you will hear a lot in the breakout sessions this afternoon. So we will try to bring those things together. So let's start, Ivon, with the global environment and recent developments, where these new rules on Brazil is coming from a global standpoint.
Right. Thank you, Matias. Yes, indeed. So as in the prior sessions, you have listened to our speakers telling you about these very exciting times that Brazil is about what is going to happen in Brazil in recent times, which is the adoption of this arm's length standard. It's true that, as Horacio did mention, it's something that has happened over the last 25 years globally. And we were very excited to hear that Brazil was finally going to adopt this standard. You were the only ones in the region with such a big economy not adhering exactly the way the OECD has put together the OECD guidelines. But nevertheless, I think this comes at a time where not only this standard has been in place for quite some time all over the world, but also because there's a lot of turmoil in the tax arena. We've seen many changes in the international taxation in recent times, mostly derived through the BEPS package that was initiated in 2013 and was finally released in 2015 with those famous 15 action plans. From that, we saw Action 1, which was the challenges to taxation of the digital economy, that didn't really came with an answer on how to tackle this issue. It was only until 2017 that the task force on digital economy was created at the OECD. And for me, it's a very interesting point in my life because I used to work at the OECD back then. And I actually came back in 2017 and 2018 with the former CTPA director, Pascal Saint-Amand, to talk to Receita Federal, to Minister Jorge Rashid back then, to initiate the conversation on the adherence of Brazil to the OECD. And the truth is that the arm's length standard was somehow in the way of your initiating process towards the OECD. After long years of dedicated work from the OECD, from Receita Federal, from the tax consultancy world, from ONGs, and from other governments who have supported this, this endeavor, we are now in the middle of this opening a new era of taxation in Brazil. So from this action 1, that's where pillar 2 came about, which let's remember that we have 2 pillars. Romero has clearly indicated that we have pillar 1 and pillar 2. Pillar 2 is a reality that it's happening. Most of the countries didn't really knew whether this was actually going to happen, and now we know that it is for a fact happening. Korea has been the first country to adopt a legislation that will put together measures for companies to adhere to this standard. What this standard means is that multinational companies over 750 million euros of income will now have also to dedicate some time to calculate their effective tax rates on a jurisdictional level. So that means that for us tax practitioners, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So that's exactly the moment where Brazil is also adhering to the arm's length standard. So there are many things happening. We have, of course, US international rules. We've seen a lot of different acts that have been enacted in the US, from GILTI, BEAT, the Tax Reduction Act, what's now called the minimum taxation, that is not exactly pillar 2, but somehow, as you can see, countries are moving towards I don't know if a better taxation, but definitely a more complicated era of taxation. We also have public CBCR. So as of today, companies only have to file CBCR to their governments, in which they include not only the income accrued, but also the taxes paid on a jurisdictional level, but also from the EU directive. They have put together a standard by which in Europe, companies will have to make it public. And Romania has been the first country to enact rules that will make this a reality. So this means that now multinational companies will have to publicly state what are their level of income per jurisdiction, their level of taxes paid, their level of profits, along with other type of information. And that comes to my 4th point, which is other tax transparency initiatives. As you have seen, we have also derived from Action 12 of BEPS package, what we call DAX 6 in Europe, and which is reportable schemes, right? You have to go to the tax authorities and say, I'm doing this operation, and the tax benefit is higher than the economic benefit. So as you can see, you are coming into a moment in time where many things are happening and where the tax department needs to speed up the process on building its capacity to understand all of these issues. As Horacio did mention in his remarks, this has come along, but what remains a constant is the adoption of the arm's length standard. So it's definitely these are very important times that we need to keep track of simultaneously on our roles on a day-to-day basis.
One last comment before moving to the next topic. We are already seeing multinationals taking proactive actions, primarily on the tax transparency initiatives. This started primarily in Europe with what is called the total tax contribution, that they proactively address and disclose the taxes that have been paid across the world, and we are now seeing more and more US multinationals following that fact pattern, just disclosing more openly and more clearly what type of contributions they're making throughout the value chain.
In Mexico, for example, when we talk about reportable schemes, it's not only the company that has to go to the tax authorities and report to them the transactions that are triggering some tax benefits. It's also the tax advisors. Tax advisors are also liable towards the tax authorities to disclose this type of initiatives. And if you fail to do so, the penalties that you are entitled to are very, very important ones on an economical basis.
So let's move. So that's the global developments. Thank you, Ivon. Why don't we go into what we call the value chain models or operating models that we've seen historically, I would say, over the past 25 to 30 years. Some of them were, to some extent, addressed by Romero. So these are just some of what we call traditional operating models. What we call the hub and spoke, which is centralization of activities or functions in one entity or two, and then the rest of the footprint left as what we call routine or a more steady type of activity. It's called manufacturing distribution, and this could apply to other industries as well. Telecommunication industries, insurance, it's with nuances, but conceptually the concept of centralizing activities, intellectual property, and so on and so forth, and leaving the rest of the operations with a more routine return and allocation of profits. The second traditional model that probably we've seen extensively is what we call the licensing on franchise model, whereby the entities, the operating companies receive what is called a bundle. The best way to describe it is very similar to a franchise operation. If you have a fast food restaurant or things like that, you have a franchise type of thing. It's a bundle of services and intellectual property, typically from one country or two. Historically, the usual suspects has been Switzerland, Singapore, Hong Kong, so on and so forth. To some extent, in Latin America, you may have seen Panama, Costa Rica, or Uruguay. But basically, it's licensing into the country, giving access to certain intellectual property and services connected to that, paying a royalty, and that's it. Those entities have a more volatile type of results. Another model that we've seen extensively and was primarily connected to the supply chain and primarily driven by the Asian supply chain was what we call the procurement centers, either regional or global. Particularly on the consumer goods, there is a heavy reliance on, or used to be, heavy reliance on manufacturing, third-party manufacturers in Asia, primarily China, and they have big hubs managing all that relationships, quality control, quality assurance, sourcing organization, some R&D. And those were what is called high-value services that they were basically charged into the local operations, sometimes separately or sometimes as part of a bundle with the goods. Another model that has been widely used is what we call limited licensees, whereby it's a byproduct of the second one. They also have access to IP and services, but the activities done by the local entity is more limited in nature. So it's called like a flexible royalty or a balancing payment, whereby it brings some challenges in the region. By the way, all these traditional operating models that we are describing here are global, and then we will go into some of the details of the challenges that we have today in Latin America. Another model that is being widely used is also high-value services model, whereby there is a significant concentration of executives or high-value activities in one particular jurisdiction, and there is a supercharge or a value-based fee more commensurate to the contributions rather than the cost associated with that.
And I think that bringing it back to the topic of our subject, the truth is that all of these operational models that Matias has just mentioned, they're either triggered by, of course, big economies like the US, like the European ones, and we in the region, in Latin America, we're mostly receivers of these type of arrangements, and you will see later on whether that's really feasible or not. The truth is that in order to implement many of these operational models, at least in Brazil, triggered a few concerns, or whether there were some limitations to precisely trying to do this on an overall basis from a multinational company, for example, coming from the US or Switzerland, trying to implement or replicate the same model in each and every country. There are some particularities in the region, and mostly in Brazil, that maybe didn't allow the multinationals to operate exactly the same way.
So again, this has been the traditional operating models. We may or you may not necessarily seen that for the reasons that Ivon explained. So what happened? So let's go through something that Horacio touched upon briefly, and we will cover in more detail now.
So as Horacio was mentioning, COVID came along, and the truth is that all of these rules that I explained in the first slide, and all of that international tax policy turmoil happen because companies move forward much quicker than tax authorities and tax policy. So there was a necessity to try to align the reality on taxation and tax policies with the reality of the business. So apart from that, and the fact that already taxation had a gap between what was really happening out there in the companies and what tax authorities could tackle through their systems of taxation, COVID came along, and we have these 5 R's that happened. The restarting of companies, most of them stopped operations because of COVID. So you could see that within the same industry, you would see companies that, in spite of the fact that COVID was happening, they continue their business, maybe not as usual, but they didn't shut down because maybe they had already put in place some type of e-commerce platform so that enabled them to pursue their business, while others within the same industry, if they hadn't started that, they had to shut down, right? They didn't have the resources to start and begin a process of digitalization or e-commerce or else. After that came, of course, the repairs, because you need to figure out how to then fix the system and see how you can continue your business, or decide if you're not continuing in that same business, if you have to shift somewhere else. You have to rethink, of course, because now that we know that pandemics can happen and the scale that COVID had, we had never, I think, experienced that ever before, right? To have completely the worldwide shutdown. Some countries more than others, but many countries were completely shut down. So it was time to rethink on a future that we weren't really prepared for, and that definitely require the analysis of data, figuring out where your business is doing better than other, if you need to maybe rethink the processes, if you need to rethink maybe where people are sit and what are their functions, if you need, for example, to have more ESG considerations, considering that, of course, mainly in Europe and the US, this is happening very fast. So after that, what happened is that they had to redesign their module, right? And in order to do that, it takes time, it takes resources, so not every company has the resources to redesign its company, or at least in the time frame that would be suitable in order to avoid any further losses that they may have. And it's also a redesign in the mindset and knowing that everything is changing constantly, and we need to be prepared for that. And some companies are more likely to act this way, some others are more reluctant, and it takes more time because maybe of the size and of the structure and of their corporate governance to move towards a new business model. And finally, the R of report, which is, of course, there's more necessity from tax authorities to have information. You have heard from Michela, the local file, the master file, the CBCR, public CBCR that I mentioned from Romania, Pillar 2, Pillar 1. So as you can see, tax authorities are more eager to have information from the companies in order to see whether they are assessing correctly a taxpayer, whether he is paying correctly taxes or not. So it's also a very important factor that you need to include within the equation of your company.
Thank you, Ivon. So all of this generated, as I think we discussed before, a number of changes. Even people moving from the models that I described before, those centralized functions, people moving from one place were physically in Luxembourg and said, no, I'm going back to my home in London, or I'm in Panama, I'm going back to Mexico, and so on and so forth. This is real life, what is happening the past 3 years. So, and on top of that, it was, as Horacio mentioned, an accelerated development on technology and digital. So this basically shift the thought process on value change and how we approach value change. So for the past last 30 years, what was the catalyst for planning? For planning purposes, what were the main drivers for that? Well, book ETR, the effective tax rate. Are we competitive or not? Our competition had a better ETR than us. There was a lot of pressure on the tax department on improving that. Now, what is the catalyst for planning? Well, it's much different. It's move the drivers. The digital transformation is one of the main drivers nowadays. E-commerce. Everything is going as a service, the SaaS type of approach. The supply chain's resiliency, as we discussed before. We see today significant changes in the supply chain, significant pressure on logistics, the ESG and energy, the shift in footprint in response to geopolitics. We need to move products from one place to the other. The typical solutions that we had before, many of them, we discussed it on the traditional operating models, which, by the way, they are not going away, were the trading principal in low tax jurisdictions, as I described before, offshoring income, and to some extent, some migration of intellectual property and or cost-sharing arrangements that Romero described. Now that shift to what? More digital principles, services hubs, eventually IP reshoring, moving IP even back to the original location. Particularly in the US, there are a lot of modeling on exporting or what is called FDII. This is a more US-driven model, but you will definitely see that in the future. And then another thing, believe it or not, we've seen more and more what is called principals or entrepreneurs in moderate or high tax jurisdictions, which at the end of the day are following where the people went back to where they belonged. The value proposition for the past 30 years was relatively simple. Income tax rate arbitrage. We have a better income tax in one place to the other, connected also with improving the effective tax rate. Let's put a lot of emphasis in there. What is now, presently, the focus is on many different things. Nowadays, we need to capture the new margins at a sustainable ETR. So the focus is now how sustainable our structure is, how reliable that is. If something similar happens again, are we going to lose again the entire substance that we have in a particular jurisdiction or not? Believe it or not, reputational aspects are even more relevant than before, for a number of angles. Alignment with DEMPI or the functions, where the functions are, that makes sense. All of this is connected to reducing the controversy on double taxation. We are seeing more and more, as Horacio described, ongoing audits that they are not going away. They're finishing one, they're opening another one. Simplifying and reducing cost, VAT and customs, and we will cover that in a minute. And most importantly is maintaining flexibility and non-income tax incentives. Those are also main drivers today. Last of not least, who is the economic buyer? Back in the day, it was typically the head of tax, with CFO approval for the main reasons that I described before. It was primarily focused on an ETR type of thing. Now, the tax group is becoming more as an influencer, and then now is the economic buyer becomes more a COO or a CFO type of thing. We are having conversations today that are even the CIO, it's heavily involved on those type of new models, whether or not they're aligned with the value chain. The last point, and I will turn over to you 1 second, it's historically this has been done primarily through tangible goods, and what we've seen recently is a significant increase in either services or intellectual property type of transactions.
And I will also add, because we're talking about what market conditions have done to the value chain or to the models that companies have adopted. When we think about reshoring, it's not only because of course, of the situation in China and else, but it's also because of a very national issue. For example, when COVID happened, I remember hearing the news, for example, in France, and people would raise their voice to say, how come we don't have the manufacturing plant of the pharmaceutical entity here to produce the vaccines? How come we don't have in place so that we don't have to go through other countries to buy masks or equipments? So it's also an important matter that is happening worldwide, this nationalism of trying to figure out how we can be better prepared in case of a future pandemic, and of course take care of the population.
So these are the new ways of creating what is called before the enterprise value for the companies. So what would be potentially the new operating models? We will see additional operating models than the one that we had before, the traditional ones. The traditional ones, at least from my personal view, will continue to stay with some nuances, adapting to the new reality. But we will see a lot of new ones, primarily in the center, that are more technology, high value, or IP driven. Those are going to be likely some of the new models that we will see, or we are starting to see globally, and potentially impacting the region to some extent. And we always see this as a journey, right? We will see the evolution. Some companies are already there in terms of technology or digitalization of their business, and some others are still in the infancies. So very likely this is going to be a journey. So all of this that I described before is very nice, is very good, but how that impacts our region, no? How feasible this is in our region. And I will put Brazil aside for a second. We had a number of potential considerations and sometimes challenges when we have the models that we described before, even the traditional ones. And some of them may have an impact as well in Brazil. I think Romero described those very nicely in his presentation. Very quickly, customs considerations. Many times, headquarters, they potentially overlook that. They said, okay, we have a limited risk service model, limited risk distributor. I can go up and down the prices in order to meet the target of the local operation. Guess what? In Latin America, we have a lot of potential challenges with that. We have a per channel, we have a number of considerations that we need to take into account in order to potentially avoid issues on the customs side that could trigger disruption in the business. We've seen cases where customs basically, and in practice, stop shipments at the border because of the significant increase or decrease on import prices. And the company was following a transfer pricing methodology that was very lean, very sophisticated, and so on and so forth. But they missed the memo on the Latin American considerations. The second aspect is value-added tax impact. Believe it or not, there are a number of potential impacts if we have a market support payment to the company. What the potential consideration of that, the treatment of that from a value-added tax perspective. Services into the country, services out of the country, how those will be considered from a practical perspective. Under indirect taxes, certain countries we have stamp tax, provincial taxes that may add into the equation and they are not necessarily looked into and may create an additional cost that afterwards creates tension.
We also have, of course, these substance requirements. Let's remember that BEPS was all about realigning profits where value is created. And for that matter, there's a more important stress on substance in the business. So that line that we were seeing and the journey that companies sometimes follow in their operating models towards a least complex type of operational model to a more complex one. Well, it happens to be that before it was maybe easier to do it. Now there's substance requirements that need to be met in many countries, and that's of course a very important factor to take into account. The benefit test, and you will see it in one of the breakout sessions. We will discuss what about these management service fees that you may receive, or maybe companies will start receiving in Brazil. You will see that in the region, there's already many measures in order to make sure that the charges that companies receive are somehow substantiated with the service that has actually been provided, but also that it brings benefit to the company. And those are very complicated things that sometimes companies need to face in order to demonstrate this benefit test.
So these are real-life examples that we may start potentially seeing in the near future, especially what Romero said, as many companies popping up a champagne bottle because of the new rules, and they wanted to potentially put Brazil immediately into the existing models. We have models for the past 25 years, okay? Are they going to fit all of them immediately the way they are? Very likely not, and we will cover that in a few minutes. But these are the type of things that potentially you will start to see, and we try to share with you some of the things that we may start to start facing. One other aspect that I wanted to bring is the foreign exchange controls. This has been a significant disruptor in the region. My own country, Argentina, is unfortunately one of the champions on that. Venezuela historically was another one that is basically limiting payments abroad. So we may have a very nice, sophisticated structure, substance, left and right, lean operation locally, but guess what? You cannot pay because the central bank doesn't allow you. And by the way, it's not a law, because there is no law saying that you cannot pay, but they will not allow you to pay. So how do we deal with that? So sometimes, and going back to Romero's point, not only Brazil started to stop receiving charges. Sometimes companies started to look at other ways or to look at transfer pricing under these circumstances. Last point on substance requirement, there is more pressure on the traders or the so-called triangulation. Argentina has put a lot of pressure on that. There was substance requirements there, and we expect a lot of emphasis on that aspect. Another consideration is transfer pricing adjustments and the implementation. It was covered, the rules looks like that are going to cover some of that, much better than other regulations in the region, by the way, in terms of addressing them. But this is another area that the implementation may have an impact on how this is being implemented. Do we do it prospectively? Do we know it apply to the first day of the year? So on and so forth. It's a service, it's a goods, depending on your fact pattern, this implementation may be more or less challenging. And connected to this is customs. We may have customs issues or considerations on that.
And also on transfer pricing adjustment, let's remember also that in order to calculate your effective tax rate under Pillar 2, any transfer pricing adjustment, if you are you will be audited, for example, in 5-year times, and today you already have put together Pillar 2 rules, you will have to see how this impacts your effective tax rate and whether the top-up tax needs to be amended or not. So, as you say, there are many issues still out there, not only for Brazil, but also for other countries to figure out the way in which all of these rules will work together in order to avoid double taxation.
Two last points on this topic, and then we move to the next one. Contractual arrangements. Believe it or not, this is one of the most common pitfalls that we see. Our agreements, intercompany agreements, might not necessarily be in line with the current facts, and that's what tax authorities are taking into consideration and challenge the positions of the company. At the end of the day, all these topics that we are discussing goes back to a single point, or more, but one in particular, which is a deductibility issue. It's the easier way for these companies or the tax authorities are doing is, you are being unable to show me the benefit test, the entire amount is not deductible. You haven't reported this properly in customs, non-deductible, and so on and so forth. So again, these are some of the challenges. I'm pretty sure there may be more in the future, but we are seeing today in Latin America, and very likely some of them we might see in the future when we look into Brazil. So we will go now in a little bit more detail what Horacio described here, and Ivon will be here. One last point that I wanted to make is, and I'm here talking from the US side, most of the US multinationals, and I would even argue that European as well, haven't looked into Brazil in detail. This is a reality. Why? For the reasons that we described before. 25 years with a completely different set of rules. And they have to manage those more sophisticated or different models that were more subjective and so on and so forth. So guess what? What happened during the last 25 years? We acquire businesses here. We acquire local brands. We acquire a network of distributors. We had different contracts with the suppliers, exclusive. Those are things that needs to be taken into consideration going forward.
Right, you're absolutely right, Matias. So on the action plan for this arm's length standard adoption, well, we need to start by the beginning, which is to conduct a functional analysis. And all of these factors that we were mentioning on how companies operate, that's exactly what the functional analysis is trying to figure out who does what, where, and how. So all of those questions now have to be on top of your mind, because that's the way you will start conducting a transfer pricing analysis under the adoption of the arm's length standard as the OECD has put together. So we need to figure out what is it that the company does, how it's been doing it, what are the business strategies, of course, of the company. It's not the same thing being a company in the first year of operation than being a company that's been here forever, that has acquired many assets that may be old or renewed, that the conditions, the economic conditions companies face are somehow different. And all of this will lead to also further on identify and assess what are the intercompany transactions. For the time being, most of the transfer pricing regime that was in place in Brazil was mainly focused on the transfer of goods and services. Well, there may be other transactions happening within your company that you are not aware of because so far you haven't been charged for, or you haven't charged the other entities to. So it's very important to identify where are these intercompany transactions, because there may be some that are hidden somewhere within your system and that you're not aware of, and that now, because of the way the arm's length standard will be put together, you will need to figure out what will be the pricing for those intercompany transactions. Of course, within the context of, and here I'm putting myself in today, right? I'm not talking about what will happen in 2024 when this will maybe be a reality, but today you also have to assess how you have been conducting this transfer pricing analysis under the Brazilian methods, and how the anti-abuse rules somehow are intertwined with the system in order to be able to figure out what are the impacts of these new rules on, for example, foreign tax credit positions, because we're talking about multinationals that will definitely have an impact on their headquarters, on their sub-headquarters, whatever. And finally, it's very important also to consider what are the current Brazilian and foreign tax attributes. So as you can see, it's a melting pot. You have to put in the pan many, many ingredients to figure out where is it that you are standing today. And as Horacio mentioned, the question that you have to ask after putting together all of these elements is whether the current system is fit for purpose, whether you will try to adopt or do an early adoption of the standard in 2023 or not. The answer will be given by the conclusions that you derive from this analysis, which could be, yes, they're fit for purpose, so it's the green box. I can continue with my current transfer pricing methodology in 2023, and I will have time to select the best method in 2024. The green box, by the way, doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. You still have to go through the process to go to this and be prepared for what's coming. The orange box is, well, guess what? Maybe there are certain modifications that are required as of today, maybe as of yesterday. You have to take some time to read the regulations, to read the OECD guidelines, and try to figure out whether some tactical changes are needed, whether there's at least some economic or benchmarking analysis to see, for example, I used to export goods on a cost plus 15%. What will be the new benchmark on the arm's length standard adoption? Will it still be 15 or 7 or 25? And that's, of course, leads to the tax function, and it can go up to the CFO level, right? How will this impact our complete cash flow situation and finance situation? And finally, of course, there's an urgent need of restructuring. So that means hands-on, you need to be prepared, you need to make sure that you're properly advised to see exactly what's coming.
Thank you, Ivon. You may notice that this slide was in the first session, and it was also covered to some extent by Romero and Michela. Why we are doing this? Are we doing this to scare you? No. Here the idea is not scare or fear, it's the opposite, it's being mindful that this is something that is coming and we need to be ready, okay? Being scared or being feared is typically brings you a stagnation rather than being efficient or moving fast. I think, just to be very clear, the idea here is to being mindful and emphasize some of the areas that we see and we've seen in the past 25 years of countries introducing rules. And by the way, as Romero said, this is the last, and this is my own words, and that's what I'm telling my clients in the US, that is the last huge country with the size of Brazil that is having a paramount change in framework, okay? What are the couple of things that we need to look at eventually if we are in that red zone? People, okay? For the reasons that I described before, it is extremely likely that we may have senior executives in Brazil for Brazilian purposes, okay, for the Brazilian market. How are we going to handle that if there's going to be a particular change in a model? Contracts that we had historically either locally, do we have exclusive rights or exclusive contracts to operate in a particular manner? Have we developed tools locally that have contracts in place, so on and so forth? Tangible and intangible assets. Do we have an R&D center here is for the Brazilian market that we never charge out to the so-called principal outside of Brazil? How are we going to handle that? The type of assets that we bought before, my examples of these local brands being globalized over time, yes or no? If that's the case, is there still a value or not, a tail value or not? What are the processes in place? Do we have a know-how on the operations that are unique for the Brazilian market? Those are all the things that we need to look into detail. So what are we planning to expect in the future? We will resume this or summarize this in 4 things. Number 1, we need to focus on the importance and the relevance of the transfer pricing documentation. We are not going to spend a lot of time because Leandro and Scott will cover that in one of the breakout sessions. The punchline here is we need to be ready, we need to articulate our story. The chances are that there are going to be some pressure on oversimplifying the documentation because we've done this before. We have 80, 90 countries that had documentation. This is one of the new 90. Probably yes, very likely not. So we need to make sure that we have that explained because that becomes our first level of defense. So it's very relevant, that assessment that we are scene that companies are doing now. The second one is the use of available mechanisms to minimize disputes. Adolfo and the team will describe that in a lot of detail. We are seeing a significant spike in disputes in the region, some of them completely outrageous in some of the countries, Peru, Colombia, and a few other countries, where they are taking very extreme positions. So we need to explore all the mechanisms, APAs, bilateral APAs. We will cover that shortly, but we have Chile, Colombia, well, Mexico, a number of countries with that mechanism. Might or may not be an option, a possibility in Brazil as well. And then there are other two that maybe, Ivon, you wanted to cover as well.
Yes, so we also have to be mindful of what's happening in the region, and depending on the situation of your particular company in Brazil, whether it has a lot or not much interaction with the region, that's something that you need to be mindful of. And also, because this is only the adoption of the arm's length standard from a Brazilian point of view, but of course, tax authorities may also want to incorporate other measures, such as the region has done in the past, in order to tackle issues and try to not be there at the moment where you are just learning from it, but also take the experience of other countries that are already that have already put in place different measures such as anti-abuse rules and deductibility requirements. And finally, there's a big opportunity for evaluating funding options in local operations. Also, financial transactions has been a very relevant topic for the tax administration because of the nature of the transactions, because of the volatility of the way it can happen on such a short notice and without that many hustles to happen. It's very important also to evaluate that, and there's also a breakout session that will dig into the details of that.
Thank you, Ivon. We conclude the session. We thank you very much, and hopefully you will enjoy the breakouts that we will cover these 4 topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.